Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello, wonderful people. Yes, that is my very best Mr. Ribeiro impression. And this is episode number 188 of the Web Platform Podcast, You Don't Know JS. I am your host this week, Danny Blue, and with me as always is Leon Revel.
Hello, everyone.
Leon, I feel like it's actually been it's been a couple weeks since we've actually managed to record. I just started a new job. Life gets in the way. Things get busy. So how you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Thank you. All good.
All right. Awesome. So, so this week we have a really special guest that I'm pretty sure anybody that listens to this show would be aware of. But before we introduce him, Leon, I'm going to kick it over to you for This Week in Web in 2 minutes or less.
Thanks, Danny. So first of all, there's a new version of jQuery. So that's pretty cool. So jQuery 3.4.0. It's been quite a while since we had a release of jQuery. So this is going to be the last minor release for version 3 before they move on to the overhaul for version 4. The release includes performance improvements, new features, and loads more. So if you're using jQuery, go and check out the blog post to find out all of the details. Next up is Microsoft has released preview builds for its Chromium-based Edge browser. So we've known for a little while now that Edge is moving to a Chromium-based rendering engine. And now there's a preview builds available so you can go ahead and play around with that, which is really cool. Adi Osmani has released a blog post looking at the new loading attribute for image elements, which will bring native lazy loading of images to the web, which is really cool. So go and check that blog post out. An article provided by WebKit details many of the new features now available in Safari 12.2. New features include dark mode for the web, intelligent tracking prevention, payment request API, improvements to WebRTC, the intersection observer API, the web share API, and loads more. And that now means that the intersection observer API is now available in all major browsers, which is really cool to see. And finally, the new Next.js feature release, that's version 8.1.0. So if that's your thing, go and check out the release notes for that new release of Next.js. And that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thank you, Danny.
Thanks, Leon. It's wonderful to know that in the past couple of weeks that the internet hasn't fully collapsed, only partially, not fully. So, like I said, this week we do have a very special guest. I'm sure that a lot of you have read some of his work. Follow him on Twitter. Our guest this week is Kyle Simpson.
Hello, everyone.
Kyle, thank you very, very much for coming on the show. It's like I said, I imagine that most people that probably listen to this probably know who you are. But for those that don't, why don't you give us a quick synopsis of Kyle Simpson?
Okay, well, I guess the easiest way to find me online is to search for Getify, and that'll be my GitHub account, my Twitter account, that's my Gmail address, and pretty much everywhere that matters online you can find a Getify, and that's usually pretty much always me. And I've been a developer for I've lost track. I've been a JavaScript developer now for almost 20 years, and a developer longer than that.
How old is JavaScript itself again?
JavaScript is 24 years old now.
Wow.
Oh, man.
So I've been around just about 20 years of that. I kind of picked up on JavaScript in about 98, 99, so it had been around about 3 or 4 years at that point. So I think it's fair to say that at this point I'm all in on JavaScript as a language, but I do have a background that is broader than that. I do have a background that was with other languages. So I was reminiscing about this just the other day, actually. The first programming I ever did was 1991, QBasic, which was a fork of BASIC that Microsoft released. And it was like only around for like 1 year. And that just happened to be the sweet spot that I was starting to learn how to program. So QBasic was my first programming. And then I jumped into some C programming. I did a bunch of Turbo Pascal. And then I moved into C++. I did a bunch of Visual C++. And I did a bunch of web stuff on the PHP and the LAMP stack. And it wasn't until maybe 2004, 2005 that I began heavily focusing on JavaScript. So I had been a developer for a while. And I think that's one of the reasons why I kind of like the language, is that I had some perspective. I had a CS background. I had some perspective. I had quite a bit of programming experience. And so when I arrived at the language, I was able to see the things that it did for me that were different than what I'd had in other languages. And I think that continues to fuel my desire, is because I'm able to uncover things that the language gives. And I think a lot of people sometimes feel about JavaScript like, it's a poorly designed language, or it's buggy, or whatever. The perspective that I have is much richer. I actually think that JavaScript is a tremendously well-designed language. I don't think that it is plagued with the bugginess that most people think. And I guess I have the privilege of having that perspective because I had done other programming before. And so JavaScript enabled me to do things that I felt limited by in other languages. And B, because I've had the privilege of being able to dig in and really learn and understand it, the more I've done so, the more I've come to appreciate the way that it was designed. And that fuels my career now. So I don't do development for hire anymore. I do writing and I do primarily teaching. But my focus is to try to get other people to see that side of JavaScript, where I think that doesn't get enough attention. So I consider myself very privileged and blessed to have that opportunity.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to hear. I've always kind of wanted to ask you kind of how you got into JavaScript, because, as you know, from reading the things and watching your courses and stuff, it's obvious that you've got a lot of, a large background in programming and computer science. So I always wanted to kind of know kind of how you made that shift. So I don't know whether you could spend just a little bit more time kind of elaborating on that a little bit. It'd be fascinating to hear.
So I can illustrate it interestingly, actually, with the PHP programming language. PHP is another language that, if you get outside of the PHP community, there's not a lot of love for that programming language. And I'm not in any way, shape, or form talking bad about PHP. I spent a lot of years writing it. It's a fantastic language and a great community. But if you went and asked a Haskell developer or a Java developer their opinions on something like PHP, you tend to get some maybe not so favorable opinions. And I think JavaScript and PHP are alike in that respect, that you have to be deep into it to really appreciate it. And if you're on the outside fringe looking in at it, there's not as much to appreciate. And so before I was big into JavaScript, I was much bigger into PHP. And it was in my CS degree, and I was taking a course on compiler theory. And I'm one of those nerds that actually really, that was my favorite course in all of CS. I really loved the idea of compilers. And I do that for fun. I'm literally writing a compiler as we speak. That's one of my ongoing projects. So I enjoyed that. And this was a semester-long course on compiler theory. And we were to make a compiler for this, made up language called C- or something. But the professor said, you can use whatever language you want to implement. And she, of course, assumed that most people would either pick C++ or Java or something like that. And I knew those languages at the time, so I could have. But what I knew from the very earliest reading in the compiler theory is that there was going to be a lot of string manipulation at the very lowest level, all the tokenizing and all that other fun stuff. And I knew that string manipulation in C or string manipulation even in Java can get a little bit hairy, and you can have like a lot of problems to deal with. And I didn't want to deal with any of that. I wanted to focus on the compiler theory part. So I went up to the professor and I asked her after the first class, I said, I know this sounds crazy, but I'd like to use PHP to implement the compiler. And she sort of balked at that, and she said, that'll never work or whatever. But I reminded her, I said, you said we could use any language, and I believe I can do that in PHP. And so she said, okay, fine, but you have to implement everything that everybody else does. Like, you have to accomplish all the goals. Well, you fast forward through that course, and as I was implementing each of the different stages of the compiler, I was significantly ahead of everybody else at each stage, because there were a lot of things that, and I'm not suggesting that PHP is the right language to go write compilers in, but to understand the theory, to start getting things done, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't need to worry about then, and PHP was taking care of that for me. And so it accelerated my ability to focus on the more important things. It abstracted things that weren't necessarily that important at that moment. If you went back and wanted to have the most hyper-optimized compiler you ever wrote, PHP is not the right language to choose. And quite frankly, JavaScript is probably not the right language to choose. But to get the job done, and based upon certain sorts of requirements, it actually jump-started that project. So I was ahead of the curve all the way through the course. And at the end of that course, my compiler was the only one to complete all the objectives and all the bonuses. And it was 10% faster than the fastest of any of the other students. This is what my professor told me. And so I'm talking about PHP here, but I want to use that as an illustrative point that I appreciated PHP so much more after that exercise, because PHP was a tool that let me get stuff done. And it didn't have to be, academically pure or something like that. It didn't have to be a well-designed language. It just had to be a very solid and competent tool, and it let me get things done. And when I fell in love with JavaScript, that same spark happened, and even more so, because JavaScript had this ability to display your results on this thing that we call the web platform. And that is unlike any other language and any other platform expression that I ever had any access to. And I think as things have played out over the last 24 years, JavaScript has proved that it has a wider and broader reach than any other language that's ever been designed, and probably ever will be designed. So that same spark of curiosity that I have, where I'm like, oh, I can get to what I want to focus on. I can communicate my ideas in my code, and I can let the tool do things for me. That spark of excitement and joy that I initially got a taste of with PHP has been double and triple fold what I've had with JavaScript over the years. And so for me, JavaScript I appreciate because it's a tool that does the things for me that I need it to do. And I fully respect that there's lots of developers for whom that is not true. They have other needs, they have other desires, there's other reasons. That's good. That's why lots of languages need to exist. But for me, JavaScript has always been, or for not always, but for the bulk of the last 20 plus years of my career, has been that good tool. And people ask me, well, when are you going to learn Elm, or are you going to learn Rust or whatever? And I'm curious about those things. But my response is, I still have more to learn about JavaScript. And I haven't fully scratched out all of the value that there is to get there. And so my fascination continues to fuel that drive to learn more about it.
That's amazing. That's an excellent answer. But I think that is really, really cool. And I think some of that potentially out of the box thinking or just very focused thinking, like your PHP example and writing a compiler in it, just because you didn't want to have to worry about, splitting strings and the other types of string manipulation. I think shows quite a bit in the approach and a lot of your writings and teachings and stuff, which is really cool. So for those that don't know, you are the author of the You Don't Know JS books, which I know a ton of people have referenced over the years, and at the moment are actually available for a lot of them are available for free. So why did you decide to start writing these books for people? Was it just, I just have information to share, or did you think you had a unique viewpoint? Which obviously I think that you do, but why did you decide to start writing them?
That's a loaded question in the sense that it has a whole bunch of layers of answers. So let me try to peel back some of those layers and share some thoughts. So number one, the You Don't Know JS books. There are 6 books in the series. All 6 of them have been released in Creative Commons. They're on GitHub, and you can read the entire 1,100-page series for free on the GitHub account. That has been true of all my writings. I put all my books out there. After those books, I wrote another book on functional programming. That one's out there. So if you want to read the things that I write about, I don't want there to be a barrier in terms of cost. I want you to be able to read that material. So I always do that. That's why I do that with my code, and I do that with my writings. And that's an ethic, a value that I believe to be very important. That said, they are available for purchase, and I always appreciate when people find them of value and then also purchase them. And I have a lot of people that tell me, look, I read the books for free, but then I went and bought the copies, and I didn't read the copies I bought, but I just bought them to support. And I am tremendously appreciative of that. So backing up a little bit to how that book series came to be, about almost 8 years ago now, I had worked on the HTML5 cookbook that was published through O'Reilly, and I'd worked on that. And the editor that I worked with his name was Simon. He came to me after that book the HTML5 book was out, and he said, I know you're into JavaScript, and I've always wanted to have a little short 50-page book written about Clojure, and I wondered if you would be willing to write that book. And so his pitch was, this is a small little pocket reference handbook kind of a thing on this one narrow niche topic. Would you write it? And I thought about it, and then I said, I would write that, but there's a couple of other small little handbooky sorts of things that I'd want to write about as well, to kind of provide some more context to that. So as our conversation went over the subsequent 6 months or so, that grew into a proposal that I was going to write 3 50-page books for O'Reilly. And I pitched that to them and said, I want to write these 3 books, and they'll be about 50, 60 pages in length, and I'm going to have them on these 3 separate topics. Around that same time, I had become a bit disillusioned with the traditional publishing model. And it sounds funny since I'd only done 1 book, but I knew a lot of people that had been published authors, and they were frustrated with it as well. And I was disillusioned with it. And so I told O'Reilly, I said, I know your marketing is important, but I don't want you to pay me in advance, and then I don't see royalties for 5 years and all that nonsense. So let's do something different. So I said, what I want to do, and this was what I pitched him, I said, I want to crowdsource this book, the funding of the advance, if you will. I want to put up a Kickstarter and see if people will back the writing of this series of 3 books. And if they back it, then that'll let us know that there's enough of an audience that it's worth my time to write these 3 books. And so you, O'Reilly, don't have to fund the advance, and people get to participate in crowdsourcing, and I can build a tribe around this and a movement, and I can know that there's enough people out there. So when we went through that whole process, to their credit, they approved that sort of unusual request. And we went through the whole proposal, and what I said was, what I'm hoping to do, here's how many backers I want to get on the Kickstarter project. What I'm hoping to do is sell 2,500 copies of the book after it comes out. And I think I can do that if I get this X number of backers. This was all just made up projection math, but I was thinking to myself, that's what I want to do. That's how I'll know if it's worth my time. As things turned out, as we started writing these books and the proposal started to grow, I realized that there was a lot more that I needed to say about these topics to do them justice. And during that same period of time, I switched my career focus from being a developer for hire, working for companies, to teaching, and primarily to teaching in corporate environments. And so I had a much richer perspective on what it took to teach a topic. And I had people in my classes and my workshops that were asking me, have you written any of this down? You lecture for hours on end, but where is all this written down? And I said, well, it isn't. It's in my head. And so then I realized what I had was an opportunity to lay down a much more complete foundation of how I see JavaScript. And as I took a step back and asked, what is it that I think people miss about the language? What did I miss about the language? Because I approached JavaScript as a toy language for many years in the early days, like most people did. And then I had a switch of perspective. And so I was able to see what I had been missing about it. And I asked myself, what do I think people miss? And it really came down to this fundamental question, this fundamental point, which is that JavaScript is this two-edged sword. Its design is so friendly and so approachable, and the barrier to entry is so low that you can literally get up and going writing a piece of code in like 30 seconds. One line of code and you've got your hello world. If you compare the hello world in Java or C++, it's a lot. You got to know a lot more just to get going. So JavaScript has this really nice, approachable, low barrier to entry, and that has always been one of its attractive selling points. That is a positive, but the negative of that, and it's not just the entry point, but really at every point along the way, the negative is that most people do just enough. They learn just enough. They read just enough of a tutorial. They copy and paste just enough of a piece of code to get something working, and they don't even really understand why. And I began to see all over the place. I would see in Stack Overflow posts, and I'd see in tweets, and I'd see in other books where people would just gloss over a topic. They would make a statement like X does Y, and that wouldn't logically make any sense, what they just claimed, but they would say that it was fact. And it turns out when you dig into that, it's not fact at all. There's an entirely different explanation or an entirely different outcome. And I kept seeing that over and over. And I felt a responsibility as a teacher to teach accurately rather than to just teach what sounds good, to teach like in tweet sound bites. I felt like it was important, if people were going to pay me their money and their time more than their money to be taught, they should be taught the truth. And so I had to learn a lot about JavaScript that I didn't know. I started seeing that the common thread here is that there are a lot of people that are JavaScript developers that don't actually know JavaScript. And I don't mean that in a, like, I'm criticizing people. What I mean is there's so much more to uncover. And I feel like at least 50% of my job in the community is to be a motivational speaker to motivate you that you need to go to that deeper level, that there is so much more that you can uncover, and you can get to the point where you find joy and fascination with what the language can do if you'll take the time to learn how it actually works. So I started using my teaching platform and my conference speaking platform to begin pushing out that message and trying to virally infect people. This is a long, slow burn. This is not like overnight I can get people to just think that way. But I tried to virally infect people with that idea. What if you knew how it actually worked? Would it change anything? Would it improve anything about how you work? And I began to codify those ideas into things that I called Getify's laws. And one of the original Getify's laws, probably the one that most people have heard me say the most often, is if you don't know why a piece of code works, then you have no hope of fixing it when it breaks. And I really think there's a lot of truth there, that we kind of sort of know why a piece of code works, but not really totally. And it's just good enough to ship, but we don't know why it's shipped. We don't know why it's working. And inevitably it breaks, or inevitably it becomes insufficient and needs to be extended or improved or refactored or something. And that's when we are essentially hopeless. Essentially, we have nothing better to do with our time than to guess. I saw that for more than 13, 14 years in my development career. In my own, I'm not talking about other people's code. I saw my own code. I shipped hundreds of thousands of lines of code across production code bases, and I didn't know why hardly any of it worked. It worked, but I didn't know why. And the light bulb moment, it wasn't a single moment, but sort of it dimly, grew from a dim light bulb to a brighter light bulb over that period of time, was to say, that's not good enough. It's not good enough for myself, and I aspire for that to not be good enough for other people around me. If I want to make a difference in this community, the difference that I want to be known for, the thing I want them to write on my tombstone, metaphorically, is that I challenged people that good enough is not good enough. That just shipping the code and not knowing why it works is not good enough. That we need to understand our tools. That doesn't mean we don't leverage our tools. Remember what I said earlier. I want the tools to do stuff for me. I don't want you to have to invent your own wheel, but I want you to know how the wheel works before you bolt it onto your car. And that's really where the title for the book series came from. There are other more joking stories for where that title comes from, but the real meaning of You Don't Know JS, it's not a critique, it's not an insult. The real meaning is you probably don't really understand it, and you can. You can, and it's not like you can achieve it like you just get there, but if you can approach the idea that this is a language that's so complex that nobody ever fully knows it, that they have to just keep learning. I don't fully know it. I spent all this time trying to become a quote unquote expert in JavaScript, and I'm not, by the way, an expert in JavaScript. Brendan Eich, not an expert in JavaScript. He knows a lot. I know a lot. There's a lot of people that know a lot, but nobody ever fully knows it. It's a thing to be approached. It's a thing to get to know better. And that's really what that title is intended to do, is gently but firmly, I think, challenge people. How much of that do you really know? Do you really know why the things you're doing are working? And could it be better if you knew it better? That's the title of the book, and that's the mission of the book, is to try to get people to ask that question for themselves. And then I hope that they find in my writing a good path to answering that question.
Yeah, that's so true. Do you think that a lot of that kind of not fully understanding, do you think that comes from because of how accessible JavaScript is? And a lot of people, particularly in the last, 5-10 years or whatever, a lot of people, JavaScript will often be their first programming language because of how accessible it is. People without a CS background, etc. Do you think that contributes to not so many people, or such a large percentage of people who use JavaScript not having a deeper understanding of how it works?
I think there's a lot of contributing factors. So I think one of the reasons why people don't is because JavaScript is probably the easiest of any of the languages for you to get quick visual feedback on what you're doing. Drop a couple of lines of JavaScript into a web page, and all of a sudden you can make stuff start dancing around and doing a lot of really fancy, important things. And that, again, that barrier to entry is so much lower there than it is to getting a Rust program up and going and doing something useful for example, just to, I'm not picking on Rust, but I'm just saying, like, JavaScript has that really low barrier to entry. And so that attracts a lot of people, and it attracts a lot of people that don't have any prior programming experience. I've heard many people claim that Python is the most well-suited language for people to learn programming in. And I'm going to, obviously claim some bias here, but I don't think that's the case. I think JavaScript is actually the best language in existence today for people to have their first experience programming. So I don't lament that. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a great thing that JavaScript, we've grown from a tribe where I think estimates back in the earliest days would have put JavaScript developers in the 100,000 or less. I mean, maybe like that number at the time when there wasn't a JSConf. Like, I remember a time when there might have been 100 or a couple 100,000 total people in the entire world that did full-time JavaScript. And now that number is estimated to be over 11 million. We have a huge tribe now, and that's great. I want the tent to keep growing. I want more and more people to come and experience and dig in and learn and appreciate what JavaScript can do. It is true that if you don't have a programming background and you see a tutorial and you drop in some jQuery widgets and you use React, create React app and you bootstrap an app and you get some stuff going, it is true that there's a temptation there to never really ask how that stuff works because it just works and you're getting a lot of that sort of dopamine feedback and you just keep going. And that's okay. I am not telling people you are bad if that's your experience with it. I'm just simply saying that there are more steps, and I hope that people at some point in their arc and their trajectory, they ask those deeper questions. They go that deeper mile. So one of the reasons is that JavaScript is so attractive, so it brings in a lot of people, especially a lot of people without a prior programming background. There's another contributing factor, though, that I would be remiss if I didn't point out, and it's not our fault as developers, but there's an awful lot of pressure that is put on anything related to the visible front end of an application. And JavaScript has traditionally been the meat of the front end of most applications. There's a lot of pressure that the stakeholders, the decision makers, the people who write the checks, the people who do the marketing plans for products, they don't understand the technology, but what they do understand is what they can see it doing. And so if they see it doing a thing, it doesn't really matter whether it's doing it well. It just matters that it's doing it. And that's a thing I can sell, and that's a thing I can talk about, and it's a thing that I can bike shed on. And that has created a pressure on JavaScript to move much more quickly than is required of, say, backend engineers, I think. And I might be a little bit, I might not have enough experience in the backend realm to be making that claim, but I think JavaScript is somewhat unique in that pressure. And so you get people saying, well, it looks right, ship it. And that pressure causes somebody to say, well, if my boss says ship it, and if I get a paycheck for shipping it, and I guess it doesn't really matter if I know why that plugin works. And there's a final contributing factor, and this one we definitely do own. And that contributing factor, I haven't figured out why we do this, but anecdotally, if I were to go to a room of, say, 30 Java developers and ask them, how many of you have read any part of the specification for Java? Or if I did the same thing for a room of C++ developers or most other languages, I'd get a pretty good showing. In fact, maybe most, if not all, of the room, they'd say, oh, I've read some of it, and some people have read all of it. If I do the same thing, and I have, if I ask the same question of a room full of JavaScript developers, I've done this countless times in country after country, continent after continent, everywhere. It's not just one area. I ask that question and I get a couple of hands at best. And I think what I'm scratching at here, I think that there is a difference in perspective, and this is that edge of that other edge of the sword that I was talking about earlier. There's a difference in perspective for JavaScript developers. We expect, because the language is so easy to approach, that if it is hard to understand some part of JavaScript, that's not our fault, that's the language's fault. We don't take responsibility when something is confusing to us. We just simply say, oh, that silly, stupid, poorly designed, buggy JavaScript again. We blame this keyword. We blame coercion. We blame this. We blame that. We shift the blame onto the language instead of, as many other developers do, saying, if I don't understand why that works, maybe it's not that it's poorly designed. Maybe that is that I have poorly learned it. And I think we have a bit of a struggle as a community admitting to ourselves that we own a lot more of that responsibility. And that's kind of the reason for the book series, was to sort of push out the resources, push out the learning path, push out the material, but just sort of, poke people a little bit and say, is that okay? Is that okay that you just want to blame the language? What about you learning it? What about you reading some of the spec? What about you following a course online, or you reading a book? Where's your part? in this responsibility. So I wish that more JavaScript developers wouldn't blame the language. They perpetuate a whole lot of that, I think, unfounded, what, JavaScript is stupid kind of mindset that's unhealthy. Instead of saying, you know what, I need to learn that better.
Yeah, it made some really good points there, and to your second point about extra added pressure onto JavaScript developers because of how quickly something can be thrown together. I see that time and time again. You get something running and something looks really great and it's doing all kinds of fancy things, and it looked, to somebody kind of outside of the circle, it looks done, like it looks ready, like
Sure.
we can ship that tomorrow. Well, really, the reality is totally not the case.
Or it is the case, but it shouldn't be. That's the real problem.
Yeah.
It is the case that they ship it. I mean, I had a job where I wasn't even a developer. I was on the quote unquote the business development, or I don't even know, some product development team or something. And I was a UX designer. My job was to like prototype designs for things, and I built like Photoshop mockups and Flash animations and stuff like that. And that was literally like my job was to prototype it, user test it, and then hand it off to developers and have them actually build it. And 99 times out of 100, they took my stuff and just put it in production because it was easier. If it already looks like it's working, why not just ship it? It didn't matter that it wasn't designed for that purpose.
Yeah, that's just in general, that's a very tough thing to learn, and something that takes something you almost just learn as you go. That, like what the difference between writing code that works and writing something that's production ready is very, very, very different. And prototyping can be dangerous for that exact reason.
Yeah.
Anyway, a little bit off topic. So I always find it really fascinating when we do get the chance to talk to folks like yourself who has been around have been around this ecosystem for a long time, where a lot of people, like us included, we just have not been around this ecosystem that long. I have a two-part question for you. So the You Don't Know JS books, the first one came out, what year did it come out?
Let's see. So the Scope and Closures book came out in, I think, March of 2014, if my recollection is correct. So just a little over 5 years ago.
Okay. So obviously there have been enormous changes in the JavaScript ecosystem and stuff since you first started. I'm curious specifically what some of the biggest changes to the overall ecosystem you've seen since your first book came out.
Well, undoubtedly, the biggest change would be that when I released the first book, it was still a year and a half before ES6 would finish and land. There was rumblings of ES6, and we knew some of what was going to happen in it. But in March of 2014, we were still 15 months before there would be a final ES6 spec. And so the language itself went through a huge facelift and a whole bunch of additional surface area of complexity and things to learn. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but there was a big change set that landed in ES6. And so the very first of those books only briefly touched on a couple of little things that we sort of already knew were going to happen, like the let keyword with block scoping. And even then, some of the stuff that I wrote in that book is wrong now because the spec changed. So I have a number of people over the years that will come and file issues on the repo, and they'll say, blah, 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 you say this and it's doing that different, or this is wrong. And I'm like, that's because literally the spec changed after I published the book. It has been around long enough that it predates, 2 or 3 of the books predate the ES6 spec. And so that is a big thing. But in a broader sense, from the ecosystem perspective, I think we had a fascination with frameworks in 2014, but it's no longer a fascination. Frameworks are an absolute necessity for most people's jobs. I can't even imagine trying to get a job in 2019 without having some degree of experience with React or Vue or possibly Angular, because just about every company takes it for granted. It's similar to the way it was back in 2010 that people just said jQuery. They didn't even say JavaScript. They just said, you got to know jQuery, because that was the only thing that mattered. If you knew jQuery, great. If you didn't, I don't care what you know about the rest of the language. You're not useful to us. And it's become that way with the few big frameworks, and also the tooling around those frameworks. And that's really where I wanted to get with in this. The biggest change that has happened to us is that when I started writing those books, it was still pretty much a thing that you would write JavaScript, and I know this sounds shocking to people listening, but that code that you wrote would literally run in the browser. And now that's almost never the case. It is almost never the case that the code that you type into your editor is the same code that actually runs in the browser. It goes through 4 or 5 different transformation steps like Babel and Webpack and half a dozen other optimizers, and packaged together and it's shipped. We have the advent of people not even writing in JavaScript anymore. That was not a thing where you would write in something like Go and transpile it to JavaScript and target the browser or whatever. And now that is a thing. So we have a tremendously much more complex, but also mature development pipeline that we have all, to varying degrees, come to terms with. I am on the trailing edge of that. So I feel like I'm way behind most of you in the community on that side of things. I have always felt like I want the simplest tool and the simplest process to get a job done. And so, I'll use Babel from time to time if I really need a piece of code that needs to run non-ES6 or, pre-ES6, but I don't have the like 4-stage Babel, Webpack, minification, whatever setup in every one of my projects. That is a rare thing. In fact, I've never run Webpack. I know what it is, but if I had to save my job, required me to configure Webpack, I would lose my job. Like I couldn't do it to save my life. I don't know how it actually works. I just know what it does. So I am way behind a lot of people on that. I've been focused on the language, and while I've been focused on the language for the last 8 or whatever years, all this other complexity and all this other maturity has grown up behind us, and I got left behind. I didn't learn a lot of that stuff. So I'm kind of new to like having linters worked into my process all the time. That's now a thing in my editor, where even a year ago, I didn't have a linter running all the time. And now I do all the time. And so I'm just starting to catch up, and I think I can empathize with people that feel intimidated by that. And also the few of us that were around long enough to remember what it was like before, we sort of nostalgically wish that it was as simple as it used to be.
We've already talked about how accessible JavaScript is, and this, added complexity of tooling systems and all this other kind of stuff. It kind of takes away from that a little bit. Yes, it's accessible and you can get small things done quickly, but when it comes to trying to do something a little bit more serious, it is very complicated. And I don't think there's anybody that doesn't feel overwhelmed by the amount of tooling available and all those complexities that you just mentioned there. So it's really interesting to hear your side of those things.
That's true, but I want to make sure that I'm on the record as saying I don't lament the fact that those things exist. They all exist for very important reasons, and they're built by ridiculously intelligent people. They know what they're doing, right? And what I lament is the fact that the advent of that level of maturity compounded this bigger problem that I was trying to fix, which is the more that you do that, the more that you create that complexity, the more that you create those other layers of abstraction, the even easier it is for people's brains to just be like, all right, I'm done. I don't need to understand how any of that stuff works. As long as I can type create React app and my app reloads in my browser, I'm good. So that we've created so much of that complexity that it's even less likely that people are going to try to learn and dig deeper on that. And that's the only reservation that I have, is that I wish there was some way to fix that. And basically the only way I have to do it is just keep saying it over and over, keep tweeting about it, keep coming on these podcasts, keep writing about it, and keep saying, knowing how that stuff works is always going to be better than that place of ignorance, or that place of not knowing, where you're really at a loss when something doesn't work. I remember the days of, for example, I remember when Backbone was the big hot thing. And I remember that if you, this is how I always used to describe Backbone, which, by the way, I liked Backbone. But if you lined up 10 different Backbone developers, you'd get 11 different opinions on what it meant to be a Backbone app. There was so many different ways to do it. And so many people were take Backbone, and then immediately they were digging through and like hacking in different performance things or whatever, because you so quickly got off of the happy path onto the, oh my God, it doesn't work, what do I do? And that is where most people spend their time. We don't spend our time on the happy path. We spend our time in the, oh my God, why doesn't this work? Why won't my test pass? That is our reality, or at least it is my reality. And I think it is for more people. And so if your reality is that, oh my God, why is it not working? If you spend more of your time there, I only know of one way to fix that problem. And it's not go invent a new tool. It's not go invent a new framework. It's not go invent a new acronym, invent a new process. It's not invent any new stuff. The only way to fix that, I can't figure out why it's not working, is to first understand why the code that does work, understand why that works. I sound like a broken record, but that's my only answer to it. And that's why I feel like that's my position in our community, is to keep sounding that foghorn, if you will. Like, come back, learn how it works. And then you'll be able to process that complexity / maturity of the tooling ecosystem more effectively.
That's excellent. Yeah, well, it is. I don't think there's anything wrong with being a broken record about things that you truly believe are important for things like the fundamentals. So one of the reasons that we have you on is that you're actually giving a talk at Amsterdam JS Nation, and we wanted to ask you a little bit about what the talk is that you're going to be giving at the conference.
Okay. So my talk is titled "Keep Betting on JavaScript," and it's a talk that has been evolving for a little while. So the initial version I gave it was a while back, and I've given it a few times and evolved it. But it is essentially a call to arms, if you will, for increasing awareness around something that I think we're not. And it's kind of touching on what we were just, building on what we were just discussing. There is, for a long period of JavaScript's history, been two identities to the JavaScript language. And by long, I mean for at least a decade. For at least a decade now, there has been a force that has been pulling JavaScript in one direction, and another set of forces pulling it in another direction. They've mostly been the same language and mostly been on what seems like the same trajectory. And the two JavaScripts that I'm talking about are the JavaScript that is the language that people write and build applications in. And then there is JavaScript, the platform or runtime that other applications use to deliver themselves. And so I would articulate it as JavaScript the language and JavaScript the machine. Those are the two different identities. And they've been pulled in these different directions for a lot of different reasons. But one of the biggest reasons is that the web has captured the imagination of the whole world. And there are a lot of people that don't do any JavaScript at all that still want to use the web to deliver the the thoughts and ideas and experiences that they've come up with. So we saw some 6, 7 something years back, a push in the gaming world. People wanted to have games that could run in near native performance inside of a browser. And that at a time was thought as almost impossible, to imagine something like a dynamic scripted language like JavaScript being able to run near native in terms of performance. And so we saw for a couple of years this development of this technology, or this way of using JavaScript called ASM.js. And that was done in large part to service an effort by the game engine makers, especially the Unreal game engine, kind of notably. They wanted to get their engine running inside of a browser and have it have the best performance possible. And JavaScript had a bunch of language-ish limitations that were going to make that difficult to get the optimization part working anyway. And so we saw this ASM.js effort, which was a way to write standard JavaScript, but write it in just such a way that the engine could cheat a lot of its normal slow stuff. It could cut out and do things fast. And it worked. What was notable about it is that it worked. We got 60 frames per second, full 3D rendering in the browser, running at near native performance, where even a few years prior, JavaScript would be like 100 times slower than an optimized C program. And we got it to like within 2x, which is phenomenal, almost unheard of to get that much of an improvement in speed. Well, as soon as we achieved that, naturally a bunch of other people started saying, well, I've got all this really complex stuff that I want to deliver on the web platform. If the web can do 3D rendered scenes at 60 frames a second, then it can do my stuff. It can do, fill in the blank with a whole bunch of things. And so that actually is the reason why I think today we have WebAssembly. WebAssembly is the next step in that, which is to say, let's just cut out JavaScript, the language, entirely. The language is limiting for a variety of reasons for what we want to do. So let's cut out the language entirely and let's just use JavaScript, the engine. In other words, let's just use JavaScript like a machine, like a virtual machine. And let's target JavaScript, the virtual machine, instead of JavaScript, the language. Well, that's now a reality. We have WebAssembly, we have WASM in all the browsers, and we're starting to see people targeting the web with things that are very much not JavaScript at all, or very little JavaScript at all. And what we're going to see, I think, over time, and this is really what the talk is about, is that the web is going to begin to have a different shape to its identity. There was a time when you could learn the web by clicking view source and looking at a couple of lines of JavaScript and a little bit of CSS and a little bit of HTML. And that was your onboarding to being a web developer. That was my onboarding, and millions of people today are developers because they got there that way. The future of that looks very different, because somebody someday may view source and see thousands of lines of Go and thousands of lines of Rust and some Java and some Haskell and some Scala, some PHP, and maybe a sprinkling of JavaScript, and maybe a half a dozen other technologies. And being able to process all of that and learn your way into web development is going to get a lot harder. So the talk is really asking us, is this a healthy direction for us to be headed in? JavaScript for a long time has been a good bet, but is it going to continue to be a good bet if that's the way it's going? So that's what I'll be talking about, and hopefully it'll give some people some things to chew on and think about.
That sounds fascinating. I'm really looking forward to seeing that for sure. This is a really good time to remind everyone that's listening that in conjunction with Amsterdam JS Nation, you can get 15% off tickets to the Amsterdam JS Nation conference, which is happening on the 6th of June this year. So if you don't want to miss Kyle's talk, then make sure that you use the Web Platform podcast code to get 15% off the tickets and get to this really amazing conference. So kind of on that, on the kind of future of the web platform and JavaScript, and how quickly things seem to be changing nowadays. And what does that mean for kind of the future of the You Don't Know JS book series? Is there going to be additional editions or new books alongside that series, or something entirely different? Like, what's your next venture?
Okay, well, that is a good way for us to come full circle back to the books. So the You Don't Know JS books have not been updated since the first edition, and they are long overdue for some updates. If you went to the repo, you would see a couple hundred open issues that have been labeled second edition that need to get addressed. And for a variety of reasons, that work hasn't started yet. But the good news is that the final barriers that have been preventing moving forward with the second edition are essentially done now. And so later this year, the work will start on the second edition work, finally. I've been saying that for a couple of years, but it's finally actually going to happen. So you can expect to see sometime by the beginning of next year, I would expect to start seeing the first of those books get a second edition revision coming out. In addition, in terms of the future of my writing, that series is not going to be extended. I like that series as it is packaged with those 6 books. The additional stuff that happens in the language will be covered by the final book in the series, which was called ES6 and Beyond. That book's just going to continue to grow to cover the beyond stuff. So that's my current plan for handling changes to the language as they come, is that'll be rolled into that second or even third editions of that particular book in the series. But I have lots of other things that I want to say about JavaScript and programming. So I have the Functional Light book that I wrote. That has a first edition, probably sometime by mid next year. I'm going to need to start working on the second edition of that book. So you can expect that. And the other thing that I really have a lot to say, and we didn't have time to get into in this podcast, is the idea that the whole motivation behind everything that I teach and talk about with programming is that code should be, first and foremost, a means of communication with people rather than a means of instructing the computer what to do. And so the next new book that I'm going to write, once I get these second editions out and because they're so overdue, the next new book project that I'm going to be working on is going to be called Code for People. And we're going to be talking about code as a form of communication, readability, stuff like that. So that's what you can expect to see from me writing-wise over the next few years.
And I think everybody is greatly looking forward to it. It sounds like you are going to be a busy, busy man.
It's good job security. I don't have a job. My job is very secure. It's not going away anytime soon.
So for anybody who hasn't actually read the You Don't Know JS book series, I highly recommend it. Very well written, very easy to understand, and no matter how long you think you've been doing JavaScript, you will definitely learn something new. I really enjoyed those books, so if you haven't already read it, definitely check those out. And in terms of being able to keep up to date with everything that you're kind of working on, Kyle, you mentioned that obviously people can find you via the Getify handle pretty much anywhere that matters, but where's the best place to go to kind of see where all of your books are or your other training material? Where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, I would say my Twitter account is the best way to keep current with the stuff I'm doing, because I will tweet about it if I'm doing it. So check out my Twitter handle, my @Getify Twitter handle. But I do have a page that links to everywhere else that you can find me on the web, and that my quote unquote kind of personal website is getify.me. And you can find links to everywhere that I am online. So if you're looking for that one central list of links, that's the place to find me.
Well, that's fantastic, Kyle. Thank you so much for coming and spending this hour with us. It is always to me, it's always a bit of a humbling experience talking to just somebody that has been around somebody that like I have from when I was first starting. I was like, I recognize that name. All that kind of stuff. So this was really, really great, and Leon and I both do greatly appreciate it.
It's been great being with you. I appreciate it. I enjoy getting a chance to talk about these things that I'm very passionate about, and I hope I hope the listeners here have some food for thought now.
That's awesome. All right, Leon. Well, yeah, this was really, really good. Do you have any parting words for our listeners before we wrap it up?
No, just again, thank you to Carl for coming on to talk to us. And of course, if you ever want to come back on and talk about anything else, you're more than welcome. This has been fascinating.
Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, this has been episode 188 of the Web Platform Podcast. You Don't Know JS. Thanks for listening, and we will catch everyone next time.